of this book, Hidden Caliphate, Sufi Saints Beyond the Oxus and Indus, written by the very talented Waleed Ziad. Dr. Waleed Ziad is an associate professor in history at Georgetown University, the Qatar campus. Prior to this, he was an associate professor in the Religious Studies Department at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and an Islamic Law and Civilization Research Fellow at Yale Law School. He completed his BA, MA, MPhil, and his PhD in history at Yale, where his dissertation won the university-wide and very prestigious Field Prize. In the last decade, Ziad has conducted fieldwork on historical and contemporary religious revivalism and Sufism in over 140 towns across Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and Pakistan. He has studied Arabic, Persian, Urdu, Sindhi, French, Uzbek, Chagatai, and Romanian. Just a paltry dozen. No biggie. His books include Hidden Caliphate, Sufi Saints Beyond the Oxus and Indus, Harvard 2021, winner of the Hourani Prize and most prestigious award in Middle Eastern Studies, and the American Institute of Pakistan Studies Book Prize. In the treasure room of the Sakra King, votive coinage from Gandharan Shrines, American Numismatic Society 2022, The Extraordinary Enchanted Lives of the Female Sufi Saints in the Afghan Empire, Harvard 2026, and Beyond the Khutbah and Sikka, Sovereignty and Coinage in Sindh, which is in progress. His articles have appeared in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Foreign Policy, and major dailies internationally. Please put your hands together for Dr. Waleed Ziad.
Assalamu alaikum. Hope everyone's well. I am deeply honored to be invited here, and thank you so much to my colleague and friend for such a generous introduction. So this is going to be a dual launch. So first of the Pakistan edition of Hidden Caliphate, and second, the publication of a 3-year-long Endangered Archives project that emerged from this book, in which I and a team of incredibly talented librarians, Sufis, technicians digitized over 80,000 pages of material from Sufi centers in North Waziristan, Malakand, and Peshawar, connected to the story that I'm about to tell. Now, this story of Hidden Caliphate is one that takes us across Asia, from Peshawar to Kabul to Russia to China. It's a story that turns the colonial narrative on its head, makes us question everything we've been told about the land in which we live. We were misled that before the British and Russian arrival, Pakistan, certainly KP and Balochistan, and Afghanistan and Central Asia were these lands of lawlessness and backwardness. It's sad how few of us today know that Peshawar was the college town par excellence before the British conquest, and that the great scholars of Tataristan, Siberia, and Xinjiang got their diplomas from Peshawar. This counter-history that I'm about to tell slowly unfolded through about a decade of research. It's a story that I was not expecting to tell. It often required going from village to village, collecting rare primary sources in actually 7 languages. Do not test me on those languages. I'm getting old. So I'm going to be sharing several pictures from my travels, so there's going to be a bit of a show and tell component to this. Also, I have to say, in all honesty, I cannot take credit for this. This is a collective effort. There are so many scholars, Sufis, friends in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Uzbekistan, and beyond, who've worked with me and traveled with me. Next slide, please. Next slide. All right. So I'll begin with a historical overview. Then I'll move on to the subjects of my book, the Naqshbandi-Mujaddidi Sufis. Then we'll talk a bit about why this story matters, and then we'll take a brief look at the book's protagonist, the Sufi saint Hazrat Fazl Ahmad, or Hazrat Jio Sahib Peshawari, in the two great cities, Peshawar and Bukhara, now in Uzbekistan. This story is going to bring to light an intellectual, spiritual network that held together the social fabric of much of Asia, a network that is either not known or not spoken about, and certainly obliterated from colonial and nation-state narratives. And I will argue deliberately. Next slide, please. All right, so I'll take a moment to place us in the world we're about to enter, and the world is bounded by two rivers. Some of us know this is the Indus River. That's one side of the story. The other side of the story is the Amu Darya, or the Oxus River, which is now the border between modern-day Afghanistan and what we now call Central Asia. The story is set against the backdrop of some dramatic changes across this region in the 18th century. So what's happening? The three great empires, the Mughals, the Safavids, and the Astrakhanid Uzbeks, are breaking apart. And out of the chaos, a brilliant and rather problematic Irani soldier of fortune, Nadir Shah, carves out a vast empire. And it stretches from the Caucasus all the way to India, and then he dies in 1747, leaving a vacuum. So after this, bit by bit, we have a slew of new states that gradually emerge in places like Shiraz in Iran. You'll see several of them on this map. Khiva, Kokand, and Bukhara in Uzbekistan. In Pakistan, we've got Kalhoro and Talpur Sindh, we've got Kalat, we've got Lasbela, Bahawalpur, Ranjit Singh's Punjab, and so on. The most important of these states, however, was built by Nadir Shah's Afghan soldier of fortune, Ahmad Shah Abdali, who was born in Multan, and this was the Durrani Afghan Empire. At its height in 1760, stretching from Iran to Delhi, an empire that interestingly lasts only a few generations, but few today realize the impact it had on rejuvenating the Muslim world at large. Now, this dynamic period also witnessed the growth of an intricate network of shrines, of Sufi centers and madrasas connected to the Naqshbandi-Mujaddidi Sufi order. I'll be shortening this to Mujaddidi. So just to understand where all of us stand, how many of you are familiar with the Naqshbandis or the Mujaddidis? Can I get a show of hands? Okay, we've got a good number. Next slide, please. So the Naqshbandi-Mujaddidi order had originated some generations earlier with Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi, who passed away in 1624, a Sufi known as the reviver or the Mujaddid of the second Islamic millennium. Hence, his followers are the Mujaddidi. Among Sirhindi's many intellectual contributions that have been supremely misrepresented in both Pakistan and Indian textbooks was reconciling the Sufi path and the Sharia into a single system, demonstrating that the inner, the Batini, and the Zahiri aspects of Islam could not exist without the other. Now, the Mujaddidi Sufis, the successors to Sirhindi, were the most widespread religious network before the 20th century. Remarkably, they appear everywhere at the helm of social and intellectual movements, rebellions, from Istanbul to Dagestan and Chechnya, all the way to Indonesia. Now, as an aside, they had a very strong tradition of female leadership. To give a shout out to, in fact, tomorrow's talk that I will be co-presenting with my mother, Waleed Ziad, and my upcoming book. As of 1800, the two largest religious networks in the Durrani Empire, both Mujaddidi, were female-led. So the Mujaddidis had established a remarkable parallel form of popular leadership which transcended and outlived all of the various dynasties you saw on the map. They're still the most important networks in places like Afghanistan, Turkey, and Indonesia. So my book, Hidden Caliphate, essentially argues that the Mujaddidis were synthesizers. They brought together spaces and places and ideas which we would assume to be unconnected, fusing Persian, Arabic, and vernacular literary traditions, mystical virtuosity, popular religious practices, and the world of the urban ulema and their scholarship into a unified yet flexible articulation of Islam. This particular, what I would call flavor of orthodoxy, gives coherence to diverse Muslim communities over a vast territory. Next slide, please. Now, hopefully we're all familiar with these terms, but just to be on the safe side, I'll be using the term pir, which is a Sufi master, a guide. The Khalifa of a pir is the appointed deputy who has permission to guide his or her own students. And the institutions are the madrasa for teaching the outer sciences, whether law, math, poetics, rhetoric, and then from there students move on to the higher educational institution, which is the khanaqah or the dargah, meaning the Sufi center for spiritual cleansing and the internal hidden sciences, like dhikr and muraqabah, forms of meditation. Next slide, please. So why is this story important to us? Why should it matter in the 21st century? Because it totally changes the conception of how the Muslim world worked before colonialism in 5 key ways. So first, it overturns the colonial decline narrative, or I should say the decline narrative that is a byproduct of colonialism, this myth of social and intellectual breakdown within the Muslim world. This idea that you had Abbasid Baghdad, and that's the high point, and since then it's been sort of wine and opium and a kind of downhill descent. I, of course, focus on Central and South Asia, where it's often assumed that before colonialism, these regions were isolated backwaters, and we really internalized this. Let me be frank. The British great game travelers of the 19th century who came through Pakistan, Afghanistan, and Uzbekistan sold stories, and I use the word sold because they still sell stories, the ones who come through here, of these as these kind of lands of ignorance, arbitrary violence, and barbarity, despite the fact that they were and are treated with the utmost hospitality. And of course, in these stories, these guys are the heroes who we still admire and we reprint their books. In fact, they are the essential books through which we still understand our historical narratives. The violence inherent in this cannot be overstated. Now, when we turn away from colonial accounts and court histories towards these Sufi networks, we see that despite political dissolution, the decay and the downfall of this region, a region from Siberia all the way down to where we are today remains culturally and intellectually integrated, and the Mujaddidi Sufis, in fact, play a critical role in sustaining a zone of exchange through texts, through education, through pilgrimage, and through universally trusted modes of authority. They were what you can call the honest brokers, who tied together the tribal, the urban, and the rural spaces and seemingly unconnected social movements across the continent. All right, that's point number 1. Point number 2. As a corollary to this, the book also breaks down the colonial geographic myth of Central versus South Asia and Inner Asia as separate cultural entities. I will argue that they are one zone. What most of us don't realize is the term South Asia is a colonial term. I don't use it. It basically means what? What is South Asia? The Mughal Empire, what is it? Where does it come from? It's a tough audience. Thank you, that's a good start, all right. Robbers, invaders, who then occupy a region, which becomes British India, and that really translates into what we understand as South Asia. Central Asia means Russian Turkestan. So the use of South Asia, interestingly, marginalizes a whole chunk of Pakistan today. The fringes of British authority condemns Fatah to an ungovernable frontier status. to the federally administered tribal area, as well as regions like Gohart, may I add, for those Gohartis who are here. So as we'll see today, the Pakistan-Afghan border is not a frontier. It's a Silk Road highway. Peshawar is not a frontier town. Neither is Kalat, until colonialism and modern nation-state borders make it otherwise. We love to glamorize the Northwest frontier as this Wild West and take pictures of ourselves holding Kalashnikovs and wearing a pako. This is disastrous to its self-image because it totally obscures the tremendous intellectual, economic, and cultural centrality that this region has. And in fact, to limit even this region to South Asia means we forget all of the westward connectivity, right? I don't want to deny the eastward connectivity, but you can't understand Punjab unless you understand Bukhara, and frankly, you can't understand Bukhara, as we'll see, until you understand Punjab. Now, third, this is a very, very different story of Pakistan and Afghanistan from what we're used to. Remarkably, the Durrani Afghan Empire, which is always considered the invading empire in our textbooks because it was the invading empire vis-a-vis British India, and its chief cities like Peshawar and Kabul was the pivot point of these trans-Asiatic networks, where you've got a host of knowledge systems, spiritual and scholastic networks, and nationalities that blend. This work, therefore, is not only about reframing and our understanding of Pakistan and Afghanistan's history, but actually tracing how this region transforms from this cosmopolitan hub with highly complex religious traditions into an isolated backwater by the mid-20th century where we're arguing whether music is haram or halal. All right. Point number 4. This book shatters the myth of the orthodox ulama versus the heterodox Sufis, that these are two separate groups. One's conservative, they're long beards, they sit behind their desks, and the other who smoke hashish. Before the 20th century, the Sufis, the teachers of meditation, and the writers of love poetry, the ulama, the professors of grammar, tafsir, astronomy, usul fiqh, etc., and the ecstatic mystics were all one and inseparable and overlapping. It's not a world of madrasas on one side and Sufi centers on another and wandering darvishes somewhere challenging the status quo. The Mujaddidis and their contemporaries integrated all of these, which made them, of course, such powerful agents of revival and connectivity. Every alim was also a Sufi practitioner. Sufis had to abide by the Sharia. Jurists had to internally purify themselves. Now, finally, and most importantly, point number 5. The book offers a very new understanding of sovereignty in the Muslim world. What is this? This is the practical relationship between the state, the subjects, and the religious space of mystics and scholars. I argue that Muslims understood authority structures in a two-tiered paradigm, and this is one which all of you to some degree will be familiar with. The Zahiri, the Manifest, and the Batini, the Hidden Caliphates. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. In this two-tier model, which draws from really terms Sufis use themselves, Shah Waliullah Dahlawi in the 18th century uses this distinction. The Hidden Caliphate of the Sufi scholastic networks maintains a trans-regional balance, positioned above the Manifest Caliphate, which is the Manifest is really the political authority made up of all of these fractured states, made up of empires in the age of empires. So the scholar Sufis provided a mix of what we can today call social welfare services, scholastic services, popular leadership, ethical guidance, meditative and psychological counseling. They were the shrinks. Mediation, trade, literary, and even diplomatic services between warring states. They could even raise, and this happened more often than one likes to admit, defensive irregular armies when required. They were the big mujahids, whether in the case of the Caucasus or in the case of Afghanistan. Or theologically, they could challenge dangerous ideologies threatening Islam from within. Before colonialism, state elites and the subjects required this umbrella to sustain this interconnected world order. Whether the urbanites and the agriculturalists, the zamindaran, the petty princes, the khans, landed gentry, all of these groups relied on this overarching Sufi network for stability, for communication, and mediation between competing parties and between the visible and the invisible realms. And this is the main take-home of my book. So there's certain things I do in this book that are a little bit different. And again, I want to add that this is not something that I planned, and this is I have to show gratitude to the way in which the world actually unveiled itself before me, and hopefully will continue to. First, rather than focusing on one figure, one place to understand these Sufis, which often scholars do, I chose one Mujaddidi lineage, one silsila, one chain, and physically followed the footsteps of the members of the lineage across generations and across South and Central Asia and the steppes. Next slide, please. The lineage I chose was one of an absolutely fascinating 18th century Mujaddidi scholar saint, Hazrat Fazal Ahmad of Peshawar, which was back then a bustling Durrani metropolis. The great historian, a mentor of mine, one of the greatest minds I feel that Pakistan and the region has produced in this field and beyond, the late Dr. Iqbal Mujaddidi, without whom this work could not have been done, he first mentioned this individual's name to me, and then doors started opening that I never would have expected. What drew me to Hazrat Fazal Ahmad is that he is completely forgotten today. Even now, go to Peshawar, even go to Yakatut, and ask about the grave of Hazrat Ji Peshawari. They're going to send you to Shobha Bazaar to another Hazrat Ji Peshawari. That's how unknown he is. Yet he and his descendants end up being connected to almost every Muslim social movement from India to Siberia, attracting followers from faqirs and celebrated scholars to the Afghan kings and at least 5 rulers of Central Asia. It's unbelievable. I'm floored. So the book ends up being structured like a transgenerational travelogue of Fazal Ahmad and his students, which somewhat mirrors my own voyage, starting from Sirhind in North India, to Peshawar in Pakistan, to Kabul and Mazar-e-Sharif in northern Afghanistan, to Bukhara, and from there to, in fact, 2 ways. It goes from here to Afghanistan and its steppes, and then goes to Osh into Pakistan, which is now Shisha. Then another branch goes up into really the frozen steppes. And finally, it ends up in the caravan routes. This is the caravan route from Dera Ismail Khan all the way up towards Balkh, ending in the ungovernable Afghan tribal highlands. So it actually ends up in North Waziristan. That's where all of this culminates. Half the fun, as you can imagine, hopefully you can see, has been the journey itself. You encounter an array of sources from the built environment, oral histories, biographies, tracts on cosmology, meditation handbooks, polemics in Persian, Arabic, Chagatai, Tatar, etc. Now, the beauty of this project was that because of the varied sources in each region, and because we've done such a poor job getting these sources together, each region, each chapter tells a very different story, which is informed by the very different sources that come out of the story. So this really worked in my favor. And this reveals how the Sufis were able to penetrate into such varied landscapes. So it's almost forced me into different perspectives in looking at the silsila. The work is not straightforward. Sometimes you have to travel hours into the wilderness to track down a single source, and it's not there. And sometimes magic happens. Next slide, please. My dear colleague, the historian Malik Farooq Chamkani, who I'll hopefully inshallah see in a few days, took me in search of sources to Chamkani outside of Peshawar. On the way, he tells me about the biography, this biography that's been lost for over a generation. At one stage, we're sitting with the Sufi at this dargah, and he mentions that there's some farmer who happens to have a book in his possession, and he wraps the book in 7 layers of cloth, and he uses the book to solve disputes or occasionally to heal cattle. So it turns out that as we're sitting there, that same fellow walks by and he happens to have the book in hand. We invite him in, and it is that book that's lost for a generation. Later on, I can tell you about other miracles that have happened in this particular journey that basically make this seem like nothing. So, another story. Next slide, please. Oh, it's a water system in Chamkani. take you there sometime. So, in fact, I think it was partially built by the Saints who had invested a lot in Chamkani. This is the Saints of Peshawar. So, all right, next slide, please. So, I'm also reminded of the first time, in fact, two good friends and colleagues of mine, Kashifuddin Chauhan and Rizwan, visited Hazrat Fazl Ahmad Shrine in Peshawar, and the Khadim opens up the storage room where we find the original marble tombstone from the early 19th century, not to mention the tombstone, next slide please, of this rather interesting Prince of Balkh on the alleyway, that's what he's known as, an alleyway right behind the shrine. This, and then he gives us these books published on Sufism, and they're published from North Waziristan and Malakand by Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's descendants. And of course, we get the address down and we head off to Malakand that day. And when we arrive in Malakand, next slide please, there was Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's descendant, Pir of North Waziristan, Jawadullah Jan Farooqi, very dear friend of mine, waiting for us. And that night, in fact, he's waiting for us in a public chalk. That's the adab, right? And that night, he gives us the entire manuscript collection that's there, and that's, in fact, I'm talking to my mother here, is where the letters to Zebun Nisa, the original manuscripts, are actually found. And we spend 8 hours. We stay up the entire night, 6 of us in a room in the cold, taking photographs of all of these manuscripts. Next slide, please. And the journey has its own logic, and I'm going to give you an example of my time in Afghanistan. Next slide, please. All right. I traveled a lot with my dear friend, a Sufi author, a bookseller. He's a Qadri Sheikh in Kabul, a Khakrub Faqir. Khakrub, one who sweeps, right? That's his takhallus. And I recall that one of the most memorable trips that I took with him was to the mountains in the Kapisa province, which was at that time still inhabited by insurgents. So on the way in Parvan, we stopped by at a roadside mechanics shop where a Sufi, having lost his ability to walk, had sat for, we were told, 2 decades. So he met us, this gentleman, and he insisted that we need security because, the insurgents on the road. So the security, interestingly, was not a gunman. It was actually an act. Next slide, please. We had to purchase 20 naans per passengers. There were 4 of us. On the way back, we had to distribute them to the needy, and we had to make sure that they were needy. So we eventually arrived at this idyllic monastic complex, and Khakrub Faqir, who is a scholar, and he knows exactly what I'm looking for, he knows I'm looking for manuscripts and so on and so forth, we have to meditate in silence, and then what do? He physically leads the community in sweeping the shrine. So we spend 2 hours cleaning up the shrine, and that was it. And then we go home. So, and the journey home was punctuated with these stops in villages where he greeted people on the street and he inquired about their profession, and if found to be needy, he would distribute bread. I remember he goes to one person, he says, "What do you do?" He says, "I'm a naan bhai." He says, "Here, take some naan." So it was comically very beautiful. And of course, I have to mention, so I don't sound like the great game traveler, that across this journey, it is a journey of trust and mutual support, and in every way, I am supported. By God's grace, I've traveled to 15 provinces in Afghanistan by road with no security, never felt unsafe, and neither should I have. Picnicking on kebabs in places like Batikot, where even the army felt unsafe. Next slide, please. This is not Batikot, sorry. In fact, I'm going to skip ahead of this one. I just hope you all get a chance to visit because this place is incredible. This is just south of Dera Ismail Khan. There's an uncle of mine who will be able to tell you a lot more about this site in the front row. I should know when to speak and when not to. Next slide, please. With that, I'm going to take us to the remarkable story of Hazrat Fazl Ahmad, the protagonist of my book. Now, the key take-homes of this very convoluted story are connectivity amongst political fracturing, that the fracturing of the Mughal and the other empires was not a period of civilizational decline, but incredible intellectual exchange. The story also offers a peek into the multifaceted, multicultural world of the 18th, 19th century Sufi scholar. I'm going to inundate you with details. I don't care, just so we get a sense of how these networks functioned and they flourished. So bear with me as we begin the journey. Now, Hazrat Fazal Ahmad, born in 1743, he was born into Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi's family, the founder of the Mujaddidi order, and he was a product of the academically and spiritually active world of late Mughal Sirhind. Next slide, please. It was a cosmopolitan town on the Lahore-Delhi highway. It hosted an academic complex that for generations where Sufis and scholars had gathered. These Sufis wrote hundreds of books synthesizing multiple intellectual traditions, whether meditative and breathing sciences, channeling energy through points of the body, I can talk about that later, or fiqh, hadith, and tafsir. For 24 years, until 1767, we are told, Hazrat Fazal Ahmad studied the revealed and rational sciences, manqulat, maqulat, and received intensive training in the Batini sciences. He attained teaching diplomas, and then he taught for several years in Sirhind. Okay? Then, we've got a wave of invasions that sweep through this area, mid-18th century, and the Mujaddidi Sufis start fleeing. Many are actually welcomed in the Durrani Empire. Fazal Ahmad in the late 1760s migrates to Peshawar, and he sets himself up then in a humble mosque where he earned a reputation by supplying vast quantities of free bread to people during a harsh drought. This is the key functions, the redistribution of resources. Next slide, please. His circle of disciples grow, and eventually he sets up an independent Sufi center. Next slide, please. In a neighborhood which came to be known and is still today known by his son's name, Fazle Haq. Next slide. Soon after, Hazrat Fazal Ahmad embarks on the first of 5 journeys to Bukhara via Kabul, establishing Sufi communities en route. In Bukhara, he establishes a Sufi center where the celebrated state builder of Bukhara, the King Shah Murad, and his son, and numerous scholars and nobility become his devoted disciples. Next slide, please. Now, contemporary sources tell us that Fazal Ahmad's disciples numbered in the thousands on both sides of the Oxus River, and that he appointed 600 khalifas. This is probably not an exaggeration. I have found about 130 names, and I swear virtually every 2 months another name pops up, even when I'm no longer looking for it. Khalifas include some of the leading Quranic commentators, the mystical poets, specialists on Rumi's Masnavi, from the Ottoman lands to Dagestan, to Russia, to Osh in Kyrgyzstan, to Sialkot in Punjab. It's rather exciting, having done so much work on the Central Asian front. Finally, a couple of summers ago, I decided just because, so well after the book was published, I'm going to visit 3 dargahs connected to his khalifas in Punjab. What's happening here? And just to give you a sense of the diversity, next slide, please. One of them was among the most respected qazis in Potohar. His family still has 2 vast manuscript libraries. And his descendant, Arazvi, is writing a 4-volume meta-history on the lineage. Next slide, please. Another near Sargoda, the remarkable Julle Shah, a powerful, ecstatic mystic who controlled jinns. Within Hazrat Fazal Ahmad's biography, there's a reference that the story of Julle Shah is, we won't mention it because it's so unbelievable that it could be a book on its own, and I left it aside. Then we end up going there, and with my friend Kashifuddin Chauhan, and with no references or contacts. And after half an hour, a gentleman comes in and does wuzu at the mosque. It turns out to be his descendant. He invites us to their home. We meet the entire family, and we walk away with an unknown text just about this Khalifa and his journeys from Central Asia to Punjab. Scared of working on it. It's going to be such a vast world that's going to emerge from this. Next slide, please. There's the shrine. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. So this, what you're seeing here, is Hazrat Fazal Ahmad's travel route, and all the regions listed here are either those with either Sufi centers, Khalifas, or a concentration of disciples. Often Khalifas are appointed to teach at their places of origin, so they study and then they go back. But several of them from Mughal and Durrani empires were appointed in Central Asia's chief cities, and this should be of interest to all of you. In particularly high demand were the scholars of Sialkot and Wazirabad. Do you know this? Sialkot, not just Allama Iqbal. There's a whole world before him that actually builds these characters. So it's certainly not just the place where soccer balls are made. Sialkot is actually a Mughal scholarly center. Abdul Hakim Sialkoti, if anyone knows, is the most famous of them, but there are many, many who come afterwards. And Sialkot's also the capital of two ancient empires. Okay. One of the Wazirabadi Khulafa, with several years after his arrival to Samarkand, becomes the revered Samarkandi saint and scholar, and he's known as Lal Beg Samarkandi. So most of the stories follow this pattern. Mobility was remarkably easy and everyone knew Farsi, so a Wazirabadi could become a Samarkandi. Now the principal Sufi centers were Bukhara and Aqcha, which is actually near the border of Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, in addition to many others that are established by his Khalifas, which then become hubs for sub-networks. For example, his son at Bukhara appointed Khalifas into Tashkent. In fact, just last month I met a scholar in Tashkent who told me about yet another world of Khulafa of Hazrat Fazl Ahmad that he discovered there. In Tatarstan and in Siberia. And similarly, another Khalifa, Imam Raza Zakori, near Diai Khan, appointed Khalifas across today's Pakistan-Afghanistan tribal border. Next slide, please. So I'm going to give you an example of how these networks were constructed. So let's talk about Hazrat Imam Raza Zakori. He belonged to a local, venerated, tribe-based saintly family tied to the Miakhel Afghan tribe of Powindas. What does this mean? These are essentially Afghan tribes who migrate twice a year between Central Asia and the Indus, and they settle down briefly between migrations for agriculture around Ghazni and around Diai Khan. This is a remarkably distinct environment as compared to urban centers like Delhi or Peshawar or Bukhara. Next slide, please. For one, while Fazl Ahmad's urban disciples were often accomplished scholars, Imam Raza grew up a goat herd, and he was illiterate. His world was one of fantastical miracles, interwoven with these perils and opportunities of the caravan journey. Wild animals would attend their dhikr. He once very famously risked his life to save wild puppies. This is a really endearing story. I always get teary-eyed, so bear with me. Once, while on a caravan journey at night in the wilderness, a female dog comes to him and starts making a certain sound. And he insists to the rest of the caravan that he has to go and follow her. They say, "You're going to die. It's impossible." And then he says, "Okay, fine. If I don't return by morning, pray the namaz-e-janaza." So then he goes off into the night, into the wilderness, and he finds out that the puppies of this dog are starving. So he has no food on him, and keep in mind, food is a scarcity here, right? So he regurgitates whatever food that he has, and he feeds the puppies, and he gives them whatever water he has, and he comes back, and this is the moment where his spiritual transformation takes place, where we're told that Hazrat Fazl Ahmad then grants him that whatever grant he needed to be given. Now, when Imam Raza becomes Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's Khalifa, there emerged a synergetic relationship. Imam Raza brings to the table the respect of his family among the nomadic tribes and their shrines all across what is now the Ghazni Dera Ismail Khan highway. And Hazrat Fazl Ahmad brings to this what we may call institutional capacity, links to the trans-Asiatic Sufi and Madrasa networks and their knowledge systems. Next slide, please. So within a generation, we find Imam Raza's sons compiling sophisticated theological and legal tracts, which cite over 100 classical works, which are housed at their center in this little village in the nomadic routes. And you're going to find the poetry of Hafez on the tombstones here in Zakori. These are the institutions where the urban domains meet the tribal. Next slide, please. Other Khalifas belong to older established Sufi lineages. Fazl Ahmad's principal biographer is a Khalifa at Mazar-e-Sharif who is the brother of the Khadim of the shrine, which is really the most important sacred nucleus of Central Asia. For those who may not know, this is where Imam Ali is believed to be buried, and historically in Turkestan and Khorasan, including in this world, we generally like to believe it was that site. We'd say, okay, both of them we'll accept, but kind of this one a little bit more. Next slide, please. Now, as a prelude to discussing Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's career in Peshawar and Bukhara, I want to provide a glimpse into a very vast topic. His teachings, which follow Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi, stress the interdependence of Tasawwuf and Sharia. His disciples have left us, next slide please, a detailed account of his day, which reflects this ethos. Now, I know the font is small, bear with me. He had a very highly disciplined life, both ascetic and practical, teaching meditation, fiqh, hadith, and Sirhindi's maktubat, his collected letters, pursuing his own spiritual practices, and then managing the day-to-day affairs of the Khaniqah. He sleeps really only 4 hours a day. And for those of you who are familiar with really the kind of the Sunnah routines and the Sufi routines, there were ways in which one could actually train themselves to kind of maximize sleep. Next slide. His most reproduced work is a just 10-page handbook. It's really a teacher's manual, and it summarizes the key points of Sufi practice. What's remarkable here, to me, is the practical way in which he presents Sufi knowledge to explain to students what they should expect on this Mujaddidi Sufi path and the core practices of this curriculum. How to take initiation, how to energize your lataif, the subtle centers mapped on the human body, to attain spiritual states. So you actually, there are certain points on the body, the ruh, the qalb, nafs, and others, which are extrasensory organs affiliated with different prophets and different colors. And one of the most highly sophisticated systems of mystical physiology that develops really in Khwarizm under the Kubrawiya ends up sort of traveling into this region and kind of reaching its heights under the Mujaddidis. Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi's, arguably his biggest intervention is on the science of the subtle centers. So he's got in this textbook comparative analysis of breath work in the different silsilas and meditation systems across 3 Sufi orders. It's fantastic because it gives us a sense of the degree to which spiritual practice had become an empirical science. The practices he lays out are so systematic that he points out that by the 3rd guided 40-day chilla, a good student should reach the station of fana al-qalb, the annihilation of the heart, and if not, this is what you can do. So in summary, his teachings reflect a philosophy in which energizing subtle centers mapped onto the human body coexist with jurisprudence and scriptural study. Next slide, please. So let's talk a bit about Peshawar to explore the distinctive position it held in the Durrani Empire. Now this is, keep in mind, 1750, circa 1800s, the period we're talking about. This period allowed it to host a spiritual scholastic infrastructure where ideas could develop and travel onwards to China, Russia, and Central Asia. In the 1700s, the Peshawar Valley greatly benefited from turmoil in the Mughal heartlands. Sufis and scholars, artists flee there in waves and they settle. When in the 1770s, Kabul and Peshawar become the twin Afghan capitals, the cities profit from enhanced trade, which goes all the way to St. Petersburg, and tons of land grants which are given to Sufis and ulema. In fact, you'll see this if you go to visit the Seti House in Peshawar, look in the cases and you'll find these documents which talk about the St. Petersburg trade. So there's still remnants of that St. Petersburg trade in the sort of commercial geography of Peshawar. Next slide, please. The result is a closely knit web of Sufi orders whose disciples set up madrasas and Sufi centers, providing educational and social services where a range of philosophies coalesce, ready for travel onto inner Asia's open markets. So I've put together this representative cross-section of some of Peshawar's principal Mujaddidi lineages. Many of these are famous scholars. Some of them are absolute giants. mystics, anti-colonial revolutionaries, they're all interconnected. On this side, we've got the Hazarat issue of Basal, which becomes major figures against the total Wahhabi onslaught and the Sayyid Ahmad Shahid's movement. Within the Peshawar Valley, you've got the Afghan of Swat. This is the progenitor of the current state of Swat, the great scholar, saint who became ruler. And lots of other figures that you'll, and then one local figure who hopefully, if not now, you will look into, which is Sheikh Saadi Lahori, who's one of the key figures who brings the silsila into what is today KP and the Kabul Valley, intellectual giant. So, next slide, please. The Mujaddidi Sufis also play critical roles in providing coherence to a region where governance was highly decentralized. A well-known archaeologist and adventurer, Charles Mason, mentions in his notes that caravans through the Khyber would be accompanied by Sufis who, respected by the tribal authorities, could negotiate the safe passage and tolls. So Fazl Ahmad himself manages a vast trade network. Elites from Peshawar to Bukhara provide him with grants of land as well as mills, which along with trade finances his centers. And he has a network of individuals, including a Hindu merchant from the Asian banking capital of Shikarpur, who are designated as the go-betweens. So indeed, when two of the most famous European agents and explorers, William Moorcroft and Alexander Burns, require safe passage into Central Asia, they were referred to Fazl Ahmad's son, Fazl-e-Haq, on account of the fact that the rulers of 5 Central Asian kingdoms were his disciples. Now, the William Moorcroft episode is a remarkable example of the mechanics of the Mujaddidi networks and their transactional economy. So here's the story. In the 1820s, next slide please, Moorcroft, ostensibly in search of horses, needs access to Bukhara. His secretary, Mir Izzatullah, who is himself a Mujaddidi, suggested that they approach a certain Shah Niaz, an originally Tashkendi, later Kashmiri Mujaddidi Sufi who had settled in Buddhist Ladakh. As it happens, this Shah Niaz had lost his Kashmiri properties when the Sikhs took over and became somewhat of a confidant to the Buddhist ruler of Ladakh. So Moorcroft is at Ladakh with his secretary Izzatullah, and there Shah Niaz graciously offers to refer Moorcroft to Fazl Ahmad's son in Peshawar, who he said will then facilitate his journey. Moorcroft, in turn, offers to convince Ranjit Singh, with whom he had good relations, to return Shah Niaz's land in Kashmir, which eventually happened. So Moorcroft meets Fazl Ahmad's son in Peshawar, who, as it happens, just at the time needs to go to Bukhara to meet with the ruler, and I've actually seen the physical letters. And so Fazl Ahmad needs to meet the ruler of Bukhara, Amir Haydar, and Moorcroft then offers to finance the journey in return for good references along the way. Fazl Ahmad's son agrees. However, due to a combination of mischief and miscommunication, Moorcroft ends up being detained at Qunduz, which is by this over here, and then through the Mujaddidi network, the king of Qunduz's father-in-law was a Sufi sheikh connected to the Delhi Mazhariya Naqshbandi network. So through this network, they managed to negotiate his release. Next slide, please. And these are the release papers. So this is a startling example of how these Sufis hold together the fabric of society. And such diplomatic services go well beyond assisting merchants. And the shrines and the Sufi networks and the centers become safe houses and neutral spaces for political negotiations. The neutrality is actually enshrined within the Mujaddidis' own writings. One rarely finds a critique of other religious denominations. And I'll give an example. One of Fazl Ahmad's trusted Khalifas have left us in manuscript form his memories of his time with Hazrat Fazl Ahmad. In one instance, there in Peshawar, he sent to the Shia Qazilbash governor of Peshawar. They're resolving some minor dispute. Now, it doesn't go well, and they end up kind of devolving into kind of curses. Actually, what ends up happening is rather than using the word shuma, they say to. So the Khalifa leaves, and then he says to Fazl Ahmad that, listen, this is expected, it failed because after all, he's a Shia kafir. So Hazrat Fazl Ahmad is visibly upset, and he responds by saying that to the Khalifa, quote, that Sheikh Ahmad Sirhindi addressed his letters respectfully even to Hindus, so who are you to declare a Shia who fulfills the religious obligations of the Sunnah to be a heretic? Return to the governor tomorrow. And then he feels rather sheepish, and they sees the governor, and they kind of make up, and the story is resolved rather amicably. I'm going to skip the next couple of slides on Wahhabism, but it's going to be a very long story. Next slide, please. Next slide. Next slide. I'm sorry, I get very carried away. This is you can read the half chapter here. It's on Sayyid Ahmad of Rai Bareli and how his story intersects. All right, so I'm going to now turn to Bukhara, which, like Peshawar, offers ample opportunities for scholars and Sufis under the Uzbek Khans. This is an unbelievable case study because here we actually find kings who are not just supporters of Sufis, but actually become licensed scholars and Sufi sheikhs themselves. Now, Bukhara has a reputation as the college town par excellence, but by the 18th century, environmental crises plus Nadir Shah's invasion had wrecked the academies. By about 1750, so about the time Ahmad Shah Durrani is consolidating and sort of entering into Hindustan, an Uzbek family comes into power and begins to reconsolidate Bukhara and repopulate the city, which meant what? Bringing the Mujaddidis in to power up the academic and spiritual scene. Next slide, please. At this time, Bukhara's Sufis received considerable patronage, given stipends to travel through the now rich trade routes to study with Mujaddidi Sufis in the Durrani Empire. And then these scholars then often return back home north after getting their diplomas. In addition, we've got several Mughal and Afghan Sufis and scholars who established colleges in Bukhara. So next slide, please. It's in this environment that Hazrat Fazl Ahmad arrives in the fabled scholastic center of Bukhara in the 1770s. He's granted one of the city's most important madrasas, the Mira Khan, from where he attracted scores of disciples, and it's here that the young king Shah Murad meets the sage. Next slide, please. Even before meeting Fazl Ahmad, Shah Murad was deeply committed to Sufism. He sought, the chronicles say, the company only of Sufis and ulama. He abandoned all the trappings of royalty and even engaged in manual labor. He even, according to the chronicles, refuses to accept kingship until he's pressured by the community to rectify the ills of the past. So 2 years after his coronation, so 1787, Shah Murad is initiated by Fazl Ahmad into the Mujaddidi Sufi path. We are told that Shah Murad would attend Fazl Ahmad's sessions every morning and evening, spending several hours in the Sufi center. Eventually, the young king, we are told, excelled in, they say his tawajjuh was especially strong, those who can translate that. So, to the extent that he and his son were appointed amongst Fazl Ahmad's khalifas with permission to guide their own students on the Sufi path, and we have the documents. Next slide, please. I've gotten access to about over 100 letters between Fazl Ahmad and Shah Murad's son, Amir Haydar. The questions that the king asks the Pir are remarkable. Highly complex questions about meditation, philosophy, training. In some letters, the Pir actually reprimands the king for being lax in his practices, that if you don't go back to doing what you're doing, I'm going to withdraw my own tawajjuh from you. I also found a fantastic letter where the same king writes to Hafiz Daraz, Peshawari, one of the most important scholars of, originally from, I think, Wazirabad, who settles in Peshawar, one of the major figures to sort of wipe out all sort of proto-Salafi movements from the region, and he's a Khalifa of Hazrat Fazl Ahmad. So the king writes him a letter, and he writes a letter back. And there are 17 questions the king poses on ontology, epistemology, medicine, fiqh, logic, theology, hadith, grammar, and so on. And it's almost as if the king is proving his own credentials as a scholar and then testing the scholar to see how good he is, and he eventually offers him a job in Bukhara, which he refuses. Now, it's this very same King Amir Haydar who personally invited Bibi Sahiba, the great female sheikh of Kabul and Kandahar, to Bukhara. So he'll show up again tomorrow. Now, just to give you a sense of the adab of the age, at one stage, Fazl Ahmad asked the king to see him at his khanaqah, at the Mira Khan khanaqah. When the king arrives, he finds a long line of disciples who are there waiting for personalized muraqabah, personalized meditation. Since the Pir had asked for him, the king naturally skips the line and goes in front. One of the Khalifas holds the king by the collar, pulls him back and says, wait in the back of the line. And what does the king do? He gets to the back of the line. And eventually Hazrat Fazl Ahmad said, listen, no, I invited the king, let him go, and then he's allowed to skip the line because there's some important matter to attend to. Now, it's under the influence of Hazrat Fazl Ahmad and his contemporaries that really a new ethos of governance emerges at Bukhara. Shah Murad actively brings the Mujaddidi ethic into his rule. At the personal level, Shah Murad carries himself like a darvish. It's a sunnah way of walking with his head slightly bowed down, keeping only 4 dirhams a day for his family expenses, and he even composes a book on tafsir. Next slide, please. At the same time, he reduces the tax burdens and curbs corruption. Perhaps most significant, he patronizes education to such a degree that by the end of his reign, Bukhara is transformed once again to a major seat of learning, boasting 80 madrasas by the early 19th century and over 30,000 students supported by the state, which means a chunk of the state coffers are actually being spent for the ulama. I, as an academic, like this. I encourage others to do this. This is actually the space where the king would actually hold his, not just his sessions of administering justice, but also where he would teach tafsir and hadith for a couple of hours in the morning. So, at this time, then, as Bukhara's academies grow, the Durrani state ends up providing stipends for students to study in Bukhara. By 1808, an extensive academic exchange exists between Peshawar and Bukhara, and Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's institutions form part of this exchange. In fact, Elphinstone, who's in Peshawar, writes about this scholarly exchange. From Shah Murad's reign onwards, a new model of kingship emerges, drawing together the Mongol and Persian models within a Mujaddidi ethical consciousness. So the royal entries, the histories of Shah Murad talk about his reign with the hadith of Tajdeed, that every 100 years a Mujaddid will come and resuscitate the Sunnah. Next slide, please. Shah Murad is referred to explicitly as the Mujaddid of the century. These chronicles present the time before him as this proverbial age of decline and disorder, in which a young prince meets a darvish, assumes the throne exactly at year 1200, which makes the Mujaddid thing a little bit easier to pitch, and revives the Sunnah. This ideal king is still the Perso-Turkic empire builder, administrator, and fearsome soldier. But to this is added the humble ascetic scholar, the accessible supporter of the masses, the patron of the khanaqahs and the madrasas, the Sufi miracle worker, the man who actually took the gold off Amir Temur's dome and decided to distribute it amongst the poor and the ulama, and a man the dust of whose grave has miraculous healing qualities. He actually shows up in several Hindustani tazkiras of Sufis. The king actually shows up as in the list of Sufis. Next slide, please. Now, with patronage from both sides of the Oxus and Indus River, Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's order expands rapidly across Asia. His last trip to Bukhara is 1814, and he passes away 2 years later in Peshawar in 1816. Next slide, please. His successors highlight, next slide, please. Bhaijan? Thank you. Acha, Mehrbani. So his successors highlight the degree to which Sufi lineages are tying together this region. The well-known the traveler and diplomat Mohanlal Kashmiri describes Fazl Ahmad's son in Peshawar as the saint of all of Peshawar and Turkestan. Incidentally, the son also led tribal forces against the invading Sikhs in the Battle of Nowshera. Fazl Ahmad's son and successor in Bukhara was a teacher of the great Tatar scholar Shahabuddin Marjani in Russia, who, if you're not aware, is probably the most important Tatar scholar reformer of the entire century, and who praises him in his own writings in Mustafad al-Akhbar, saying that half of Bukhara came to the funeral. Several great Siberian sheikhs were his khalifas, sheikhs who pondered over such questions as to whether the evening prayers could be skipped in the event of 3 hours of daylight, which is of course an issue in Siberia. Next slide, please. Fazl Ahmad's son in Kokand, this is modern day Farghana, was almost like the patron saint of the Khanat of Kokand. His disciple was Muqimi, one of the greatest poets of the Chagatai Turkish language, of modern Uzbek actually. Another family member was a famous ambassador to St. Petersburg who negotiated with Tsar Nicholas on behalf of Kokand. Next slide, please. One of the largest madrasas, this in fact is the Khanaqah and the madrasa of his son, and today if you go there, they will all know that it is the son of Imam Rabbani and that the family is from Peshawar. It is one of the important sort of tourist centers now in the city of Kokand. One of the largest madrasas in Xinjiang in China until the 20th century, the Chong Madrasa, was actually part of Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's lineage via the city of Osh in today's Kyrgyzstan. And that's another fantastic story that I will skip for now. Next slide, please. Surprisingly, the last of Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's great descendants in the latter 20th century was the great saint of North Waziristan, Hazrat Abdullah Jan Farooqi, who was the pir of the tribal belt on both sides of the Afghanistan-Pakistan border throughout all of the brutal Afghan wars. And he appointed 80 khalifas, several still alive, even ran a publishing house, writing books on Sunni doctrine, on metaphysics, on philosophy, on poetry, and meditation in 4 languages. He's a poet in actually all 4 languages as well. Next slide, please. So now, as I was working with the Waziristan and Malakan lineages of Hazrat Abdullah Jan, it became evident that there was a lot of material, not just at the Sufi centers, but scattered across this whole region. So along with Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's descendants, we decided to collect the material together. So we end up recovering thousands of pages of unpublished poetry, articles, letters, memoirs of just Hazrat Abdullah Jan Farooqi alone, documenting a completely buried history of the tribal areas as a place of spirituality and intellectual rigor. Now, I challenge you to find any sources on Waziristan that don't deal with it as a problem, the Waziristan problem, right? Because the whole area has been written as the federally administered tribal areas, the outside, the last little zone between the great civilizations kind of, coming together, and this is the last bastion of the old barbaric world. It is really a place, frankly, that hasn't been touched by the post-colonial critiques at all. And even the ones writing post-colonial literature still treat it as such. Abdullah Jan and this treasure trove we find will allow us to recover local voices. He led the most incredible life. He was a school teacher who even wrote a children's illustrated reading book, particularly for Pakhtuns. He was an activist for the Khudai Khidmatgar, a major figure in the struggle against extremism. In fact, it's a huge part of the story in the 70s and 80s. He's a mobilizer of the Mujahideen, an arbiter of tribal jirgas, and a Sufi sheikh. So this is the beginning of a very long archival project, and we received a grant from the Endangered Archives Project to train a digitization team. And then, next slide, please. The Sufi Center, sorry, next slide. This is a rather proud moment. The Sheikh at North Waziristan is offering my book to one of the great Mabel Sharif, the Pir of Mabel Sharif, which is one of the lineages that comes out of this broader zone. So what we end up doing is we end up approaching the Sufi Center of Shah Muhammad Ghaus Peshawari, which is the oldest Khanaqah in Peshawar, led by, in the last generation, by Hazrat Amir Shah Qadri or Maulvi Ji, the teacher of teachers of the ulama of Peshawar. The librarian there, Taqi Hassan, next slide please, is absolutely brilliant. And he trained a team of local archivists, so across kind of this Malakand and down. And we prioritize works that captured the sacred history of KP and Afghanistan, and about 300 manuscripts, using a post-custodial approach that's basically a fancy way of saying you keep the material there and you empower those to whom it belongs to actually then distribute it further. Now, all of this collection that we put together really attests that Fazl Ahmad's Sufi silsila is still very much alive in the ungovernable tribal belt in the 21st century. Next slide, please. So this is just a couple of slides of the digitization process. Next slide. Next slide. All right. Now, I'd like to finish with this image of a shajra at Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's grave in today's Peshawar. Now, this shajra gives us a sense of how all the branches of the Mujaddidi lineage are interconnected in the Mujaddidi consciousness, even today, covering modern-day Pakistan, Afghanistan, and India. So, can you go one slide ahead, please? One more ahead, please. Thank you. Yeah. So, the Hazrat Fazl Ahmad's over here. Vis-a-vis female leadership. So all of these various lineages are there, but note something rather interesting. The complete absence of Central Asia, representing really the breaking of the historical chains that I discussed, which is a direct result of the partitions from the British-Russian Great Game. And this is a process that I trace out in my book. Last slide, please. Actually, we can just leave it here. I hope this gave you a sense of the many ways in which the Sufi network functioned. In summary, all of this in one bag, what emerges is a vast zone of highly complex intellectual and spiritual discourse, reaching well into the tribal and Kohistani regions, a zone mediated by Sufis who incorporated both spiritual and practical knowledge systems, a thread that brought together the world on both sides of the Oxus and Indus rivers. Thank you very much. Do we have time for questions, or is everyone exhausted? Ji. Idak. Yeah. May I ask why you're asking? Absolutely. Excellent. So the Khanaqah is in Malakand and in Idak, so do check it out, please. And there's more and more, you'll see intellectual production coming out of this network. Yes. No questions. All right. Thank you very much.